Hello and welcome to the Week in 60 Minutes, brought to you by SpectatorTV and broadcast on Thursday, the 25th of August. I'm Kate Andrews, the Spectator's economics editor, and your host this week. What didn't the government tell us about lockdown? Rishi Sunak goes public in an exclusive interview for this week's magazine, saying the government stifled debate about whether lockdown policies worked or not. Fraser Nelson, who interviewed Rishi Sunak, will be on the show. The effects of lockdown are still being felt today in education, the health service, and the economy. Michael Simmons will run us through the latest data. The revelations come as the Tory leadership contest enters its final fortnight. Andrew Neil and Katy Balls will give us our political update. Turning to China, Cindy Yu asks in a column this week why either you're a China hawk or a shill for Beijing. There's no options in between, she says. A new book, Second City, looks at how Birmingham became so central to British history. But is the city overlooked? I'll speak to the author Richard Vinen and to Adrian Wooldridge. And finally, should we laugh when someone gets chased by cows? John Connolly doesn't think so. He'll join me. A Spectator subscription is now better value than ever before. As a new subscriber joining today, you'll pay just £1 a week for unlimited online and app access in your first year. To subscribe today, go to spectator.co.uk/TV offer. And why not subscribe to our YouTube channel? Click the red subscribe button at the bottom of this video and tap the bell icon to make sure you never miss an episode. It was wrong to scare people like that. That's a quote from the new interview with Rishi Sunak in this week's Spectator. The former Chancellor, and now leadership hopeful, has gone public on how the government stifled criticism of lockdowns. Certain officials, he says, were too powerful and went too far. Fraser Nelson, the editor of The Spectator, spoke to Rishi Sunak, and he joins me now. Fraser, for this week's magazine, you spoke to Rishi Sunak, former Chancellor of the Exchequer and now leadership contender. He has decided to go on the record about what really happened during lockdown, specifically what big decisions were and weren't being made inside Whitehall. Can you tell us about it?
Yes, I've been hearing rumours for quite a while that Rishi Sunak was constantly the voice of opposition, if you like, about lockdown. Not so much that he was opposed to it, but he was saying, look, if you're going to close down the schools, then let's talk about what's going to happen to the children who are going to be at home. You'd hear that he'd get angry at meetings saying, look, my kids are at private school, my wife can take time off work to look after her kids. What about the working class single mother who will absolutely not have those options? Where are the models for what's going to happen to them? And when I tried to stand up this story when he was still Chancellor, I didn't get very far. He was quite clammed up. So you'd hear rumours, but you could never confirm it. Now that he has quit government and he hasn't got much to lose, certainly his despair at Boris Johnson isn't exactly a secret anymore. So I thought, like I said to him, look, why don't you just go on the record and talk about lockdown? People need to know about this. And he very much agreed. To be honest, I'm not quite sure why he didn't do it earlier, because what he had to say, I think, was quite dramatic. And I think it does demonstrate that at least in that government there was somebody who was trying to ask the basic questions. Now, what really shocked me about the whole interview was that it was exactly as bad as we suspected. That even, not just in the cabinet, but the Quad, the top 4 people of government, they weren't asking questions, really, about what the long-term health impacts were going to be. What was the cancer impact? What would it do to the NHS waiting list? What would it do to the economy? And there was a policy, Rishi Sunak says, that you weren't even allowed to talk about this as a minister. You were given these lines to take, the script, as he calls it, and the script was that you were not allowed to acknowledge that any drawbacks to lockdown. And he said he was appalled to find that rather than level with the public and be honest about the gamble that was being taken, that instead they got this fear messaging, this relentless, these posters saying, look him in the eyes and tell him you'll never flout the rules. And these fear posters, Rishi Sunak said, were opposed by him, opposed by his team at the Treasury, because he felt they would do really bad damage to the national psyche. There were surveys, he was saying, showing that Britain was least likely of all countries in Europe to bounce back from recession. Because if you hammer this message of fear to the public, you can expect long-term ramifications. And lo and behold, that's what happened. Britain ended up with the worst economic damage in the whole of Europe. So it was a pretty depressing experience hearing that the quality of decision-making in government was exactly as bad as we had feared.
There are a lot of new pieces of information in this piece, the cover piece for the magazine this week. I would encourage all Spectator TV watchers to read it. Two things in particular really jumped out to me when I read through your piece, Fraser. The first is the moment where Rishi Sunak is having one of these meetings and he finally decides that it's time to talk about education. Now, he, of course, is not the education secretary, he's the finance guy, but he brings it up and he's met with silence because nobody else wants to talk about what's happening to children while they're home not getting proper schooling. The second thing that I thought was very interesting is that he had a Treasury mole on a lot of these SAGE phone calls and meetings that they didn't realize was there for a long time. So he was getting some feedback from the meetings where they would discuss things, which actually turned out to very often be different from the reports that cabinet ministers would get. And broadly speaking, it was not being reported to politicians that there actually was dissent and there was disagreement in a lot of these meetings. It was intentionally designed to make politicians and certainly the public think that there was complete consensus on lockdowns and how severe they had to be and how long they had to be, but it really wasn't the case. So I was wondering if you could speak to both of those things.
Well, the first point about education, I mean, the shocking thing he was saying was it was the first time that anybody had really made that point. He was saying it was an emotional point, it wasn't a policy one. He was saying surely those of us around this table can agree that denying classroom education to kids is a bad thing that will harm them. And he says that you wouldn't even get agreement on that point because such was the culture created in Number 10 that to speak rationally about lockdown having bad effects as well as potentially good ones, that was a heresy. If you were to use your mind and try to ask natural probing questions about what happens when you close down society, at that stage it had become seen as an attack on Boris Johnson personally. Now, Rishi Sunak said that it was time after time he was the only person in the cabinet making these points, and pretty soon he became suspected of Number 10 of basically doing this for political manoeuvring, of trying to position himself as the next Prime Minister. Perhaps that's where the Rishi-Boris tension originated in those lockdown discussions. Now, also SAGE, I found this personally one of the most interesting points of it. We all know that when we were locked down, it was on the same format. These scientists were paraded with as basically being our real government. Now, Rishi Sunak was saying that they decided, rather than to present lockdown as a political decision, which it was, to present it as following the science. Now, of course, if you say you're following the science, then you're more protected from scrutiny. But in order to get away with that, you needed to elevate SAGE, which was only ever set up as a sprawling committee of various advisors, into some kind of mini lockdown government who would go away and come up with memos, and those memos would be sent to the cabinet meeting, and that all of a sudden would be what they had to do, because if they wanted to follow the science, then they had to do whatever SAGE said. So you had a complete collapse in democratic responsibility. There was no accountability in Parliament, because Boris Johnson had used emergency powers to do whatever he wanted. There was no discussion in Cabinet, because the Cabinet were given instructions, they weren't let in on it. And even when it came to, again, the very top people in government, including the Chancellor of the Exchequer, he said that he was asking all the time, how did SAGE come to this recommendation? What are the assumptions behind his model? What happens if those assumptions are wrong? This picture might not look as dreary if you change the assumptions. And he was saying that even he, as Chancellor of the Exchequer, wasn't told what assumptions were used to complete these SAGE models upon which the country was locked down. Now, this is, as he says, this is just sheer incompetence. If you're going to make any decision in public health, you do a cost-benefit analysis, what's sometimes called a QALY analysis, a quality of life years analysis. If you're going to change the regulation on junk food advertising, on cancer screening, you would do a cost-benefit analysis. But at no point, Rishi Sunak says, at no point was this analysis ever done for lockdown, the most dramatic, the most draconian principle ever introduced in post-war British government. So the lives of millions of people, the livelihoods of people, their children's education, and a whole bunch of other things, from whether you could visit your relatives to whether you could attend your parents' funeral, all of these were decided on policies that were being rushed through with nothing resembling the sort of scrutiny that you would require. And we only know this because Rishi Sunak has now come out and said it.
Fraser, let's look into those SAGE graphs a little bit more and the assumptions behind them, because something I found really interesting in the piece was that Rishi Sunak was suggesting if these kinds of graphs landed on my desk about anything related to his remit, about the economy, about finance, he would not have accepted them. The assumptions behind them were not good enough or even clear or even stated. They were essentially, in many cases, he felt half-baked. And if they landed on his desk for another reason, he would have just said, throw them out, start again. And I remember at the time there was a real culture building up in the UK that to question these SAGE graphs was essentially to question fact. And it was very nerve-wracking to do sometimes. And in fact, I think one of the major reasons that the Spectator created its data hub was to give the public access to these graphs, just the straight numbers, so that the data in almost real time could be available at their fingertips, because we didn't think that was being made available or put forward by what was happening in government. And dare I say, some of us had a suspicion that these numbers weren't being crunched properly. But again, it was very scary at points to suggest that because of the names that might come your way. It feels like Rishi Sunak is only validating the fact that these graphs really weren't up to scratch, and he certainly didn't feel like this was the best kind of analysis that could be landing on his desk.
Yeah, and as Rishi Sunak says, that by the time the fourth lockdown came along, it didn't happen, by the way, that was last December, by then he had eventually managed to put a team around him. He'd managed to hire some modelers, because previously he lost all the Treasury modelers to the Office for Budget Responsibility. So he had the apparatus he needed to sense-check the SAGE analysis when it came in last December. Now, because exactly the same manoeuvrings were taking place, he was saying they were all set to call a press conference and announce a lockdown. So he flew back from California and pretty much threatened to resign and said to Boris Johnson, look, you've got to have a cabinet meeting, because if you do, then the cabinet will all, virtually to a man, apart from Michael Gove and Sajid Javid, then Health Secretary, the rest of them will be anti-lockdown and they'll give you the political cover that you need. Now, when that happened, we saw for the first time how SAGE predictions compared to reality. So when the SAGE memo, which cabinet members were sent last December, said that the deaths could be up to 6,000 a day. That was the upper bounds of limit given to them. And in the end, I think that was out by a factor of 20. But Rishi Sunak knew this because JP Morgan, an investment bank, had done its own analysis based on real-world South African data and said, actually, if you look at the South African trajectory, it means that Britain can carry this without lockdown. So let's consider this. Again, the livelihoods and lives of millions of people were on the line last December. The official advice being given to ministers gave them something like 14 different scenarios, all of which were bleaker than what actually turned out to be the case. But the JP Morgan analysis from a bunch of bankers who've got no real professional interest in modelling lockdown, that was accurate. So ministers were being spun. They were being spun with graphs which Rishi Sunak says they were unable to challenge. And who knows how much unnecessary damage was done. Because let's remember, in the February of 2020, after the vaccine, sort of 2021, when the vaccines had come along, there was a big decision taken to keep us all on lockdown right up until July. That was devastating news for those who thought the vaccines might translate into being able to liberalise the economy. And that decision was taken because of SAGE modelling. Rishi Sunak has now confirmed what we all suspected, that SAGE modelling was not something that could be properly tested by government. In his suspicion, it was probably wrong, and it didn't pass anything like the scrutiny or the robustness or the basic kind of critical questioning that you would need to make any public health intervention, let alone closing down or locking down a country.
Fraser, critics will question the timing of Rishi Sunak's intervention here. They'll point to the leadership campaign. They'll say that this is a very convenient moment for him to put out his version of events, to paint himself as the anti-lockdown minister, or at least the one who was questioning lockdown when he suggests everybody else was relatively relaxed about the prolonged infringement on our civil liberties. Do you believe Rishi Sunak's version of events? Are they credible to you? Do they stack up?
They are credible to me because it squares with what I'd been told at the time. I also was a recipient of a hostile number 10 briefing against Rishi Sunak, where I was told by one of Boris Johnson's aides that here was this chancellor, he was against the lockdown, he was basically, effectively more relaxed about people dying of COVID. Pretty hostile briefing. So this does square with, and also there are other anecdotes moving around. Also, this wasn't his idea. It wasn't the brainwave of the Sunak campaign to talk about lockdown. This was something that I've been trying to push him to do for quite some time, basically saying that he had nothing to lose now from telling the complete truth. I mean, when he was in lockdown, of course he couldn't go on. So when he was in government, of course he couldn't say that Boris Johnson was responsible for all of his bad decisions. You can't do that without resigning. But when he had resigned, he didn't want to talk about his role in lockdown. But I thought this was a very rare moment where during the campaign, where he was still in the mood for giving interviews, he might not be if he loses this contest and goes into sort of semi-political retirement, that it was a good chance to get him on the record and to get him to speak freely. And my gosh, he spoke freely.
And I suppose nuances are important here. When I read your write-up, I didn't come away thinking that Rishi Sunak was actually anti-lockdown. I came away thinking that he was frustrated that there was no discussion of trade-offs through that almost 2-year process.
Yes, I mean, at the end of it, I said to him two things. First of all, public opinion was so strongly for lockdown, something like 70%. Could any Prime Minister really have stood up to that level of public demand? And he was saying, well, look, public opinion was shaped partly by the government's fear messaging. And also, it was never explained to people that there was pros and cons to lockdown. If they thought the lockdown might deprive their kids of education, they might never get back, it might lead to an NHS backlog, it might lead to greater excess deaths from cancer and what have you, then they might not have been so much in favour of it. But also, fundamentally, he didn't have much there wasn't much of an agenda here for him. Of course, he'll think to himself this will probably help him with the Tory party members who, broadly speaking, were anti-lockdown. But if he was going to make this a core part of his campaign, he would have done it from day one. We're right now in the last week of the campaign. Probably the majority of Tory party members have cast their vote. So I don't think this revelation is going to help him really in the Tory leadership race. But for those of us trying to piece together what happened in lockdown and trying to work out if it really was as bad as we suspected, this interview certainly puts on the record lots of things which I think people need to know about. All of our lives were affected by this. And I think that the sheer lack of scrutiny, lack of thought, lack of testing, lack of discussion in the government is something that deserves to be put on the public record.
Fraser, thanks for joining me. The pandemic might be over, but the effects of lockdown are still being felt. Exam results have been skewed, hospital figures are awful, and the economy is in a bad state. To explain what's behind the data, I'm joined now by the Spectator's data journalist, Michael Simmons. Michael, thanks for joining me on Spectator TV. With this summer's exam results a mess, and with the NHS waiting list growing ever more dire, the effects of lockdown are becoming clear. Let's start with education. Can you run us through what happened with this year's results and how lockdown had an effect on that?
Yep, so this year's exam results were interesting because, as I'm sure everyone will know, this is the first year that we went back to kind of normal exam conditions. Over the past 2 years of lockdowns and the pandemic, we had a variety of systems involving algorithms and teacher-assessed grades, but this year was the first year that exams were effectively back to normal. And the Department of Education had actually decided that grade inflation, as we've written about in The Spectator, has been a big problem. In last year, I think something like 20% of A-level students were getting, the top highest grades, which is just, the system is kind of not designed for that. So this year they decided that they wanted to get the kind of grade results sort of closer to normal. And what's happened in the results that came out last week was that the grades were lower than they had been during teacher assessment years, but they're still inflated kind of on pre-pandemic. And kind of what the results this year really show us is the effects that grade inflation and kind of who benefited, because we've seen different trends go back to normal. So for instance, kids in private schools seem to do better when there was teacher-assessed grades. Girls tend to do better when there's teacher-assessed grades. So now that it's gone back to exams, when those numbers have gone down a bit, it's kind of more evidence to the picture that, yes, this was kind of all caused by lockdown. And one really interesting example recently is there's been a study about the GCSE results that suggested that basically there's always been this gender gap And it was thought that that gender gap got worse during the lockdown years because basically girls were more likely to actually study while boys were all on their PlayStations. And this is something that kind of doesn't happen if you have or happens to a lesser extent if you have a normal exam system.
Now that we're back to assessing grades in the pre-pandemic way, is this eventually going to work itself out? And that's not meant to overlook the huge upset that this is causing kids and causing these students as they try to make their grades for university. But do we consider this to be a relatively short-term issue, or will have lockdown changed this and created problems for the longer term as well?
Well, it's kind of a difficult one to answer because grade inflation, certainly at A-level, was kind of a long-term trend anyway. But it was kind of just like a small inflation every year. And then the pandemic years just absolutely inflated that, like, you know, a kind of gentle slope turned into like a vertical line. And so it's going to be difficult as they balance it out, and the government is going to have to decide what they want to do about grade boundaries. But I think kind of longer term, the questions that lockdown has posed about inequalities with how exams and education is administered, you can't just go back to normal now that kind of this information has been highlighted. So I don't think things will go back to normal over the long term, but not for any sort of natural reason, but because the government is probably going to choose not to go back to normal.
Meanwhile, we have new figures for NHS waiting times that were released recently, with nearly 30,000 people waiting more than 12 hours to get into A&E just last month. This is the worst ever number recorded. How has it gotten so bad?
Well, I think this is a question that even the NHS themselves are kind of struggling to answer, because there's the obvious part, which is that people missed appointments in the pandemic, and now there's just this huge backlog of people, you know, on waiting lists for treatment. But why things are particularly acute in A&E and ambulance services in, you know, the height of summer is kind of really puzzling people. But one aspect that the NHS are now kind of looking at as the kind of probable cause is bed blocking that we've kind of all been talking about for years has kind of got really big during the pandemic, because after, you know, in the first year of the pandemic, when there was all the cases of people being moved to care homes and did that cause care home outbreaks, that's kind of stopped now, and it's harder to get into care homes. So there's just a huge amount of bed blocking in the NHS, which, you know, balances down between like from ward to ward for ward to A&E department. And so people who just cannot get into the A&E departments cannot see their doctors and can't even get an ambulance.
And I imagine this has a knock-on effect. So people are waiting in the ambulance, they can't get into a bed in hospital, and then people at home are waiting for the ambulance, which can't come to them because they're still taking care of somebody who isn't being admitted yet.
Well, exactly. And the near 30,000 figure that you highlighted for people that are waiting 12 hours, that's people that are waiting 12 hours, you know, once they actually get into the A&E department. That doesn't necessarily take into account of people that are, you know, waiting up to, in some cases, 10 hours in an ambulance before they actually even get through the doors of the emergency department.
Wow, that's terrifying stuff. Something else really frightening out this week is the new, very grim data around excess deaths figures in the UK. Can you talk us through them?
Yeah, so excess deaths have kind of been rumbling along this year, that they seemed kind of higher than normal, and, you know, a few people were kind of worried about it, but kind of it was kind of a below the radar story. But in recent weeks, it's just really it's really exaggerated and, you know, come to the fore. We found that in 15 weeks of this year, the average for England and Wales has been about 1,000 extra deaths. You know, the last week of data, there was over 1,000 deaths as well. And what's really worrying doctors is that because, unfortunately, you know, during the pandemic, it tended to be the older and vulnerable people who were killed. You know, you were 70 times more likely to die of COVID if you were older than if you were younger. That would kind of suggest that, shouldn't, now that COVID's in a sense behind us, should we have less deaths? But the opposite is true, and that's really concerning people. And we now have some data on some of the causes for that, and it looks to be mainly heart conditions and also diabetes. So, you know, that poses all its own questions.
Michael, thanks for joining me. We're entering the final fortnight of the leadership contest. Liz Truss looks very likely to win, but there's still a couple more hustings left. What should we expect in these final few days, and what's Truss's plan for government? I'm joined now by the Spectator's chairman, Andrew Neil, and by our deputy political editor, Katy Balls. Andrew and Katy, thanks for joining me. Now, Andrew, in this week's politics column, Katy writes about the many problems that are going to face probably Liz Truss, who's most likely to enter Downing Street in 2 weeks' time. The new Prime Minister won't be able to get anything done, she writes, unless she brings the party together. Now, do you think it's possible, Andrew, to create that kind of unity right now, given the current makeup of MPs and how they feel about Liz Truss in particular?
Well, it's a good question, and Katy's column is a must-read on this subject because it shows, I mean, in some ways, Rishi Sunak, who is almost certainly going to lose, they should be thinking this is a good election to lose because the inheritance of the new incumbent of number 10, probably we think on September the 6th, she becomes Prime Minister, Liz Truss, is going to be terrible. And I'm sure we'll come on to some of that economic inheritance in a minute. But the thing that Katy points out too is the political inheritance. I mean, this is now an unruly Conservative party. It's got rebellion in its blood now. It's divided by North and South and Toffs and blue, red wall Tories, that she doesn't command widespread support on the backbenches either. And I think when the going gets tough, then Conservative MPs prefer to squabble among each other, and I think she could well face lots of rebellions. Now, you could take the view that there's an election coming, maybe still be 2 years away, but it's on its way, that they've had enough of rebellion and it's time to buckle down and behave more like a governing united party. But I don't detect that. I mean, I think Liz Truss will be regarded as quite a weak Prime Minister in the first place. And my guess would be that these rebellious Tories will continue to cause trouble and make life difficult. At a difficult economic time, they'll add to that by making it politically difficult for a Prime Minister to govern as well.
Katy, what's Liz Truss's best bet for reuniting her party? You report in your column this week that the government in waiting is being assembled at Chevening, the Foreign Secretary's grace and favour home. Will they be taking a balanced approach looking at the next government with reunification in mind? Or do you think this is going to be more focused on who was loyal to Liz in terms of who gets those top jobs?
So I think there's a general hope, of course, to unite the party because, as we have just heard from Andrew, you need to do that really to have a functioning government that just isn't dominated in terms of day-to-day business on multiple rebellions. But you've also have a campaign where I think it's no great secret that Liz Truss appears to have promised quite a lot of people jobs. And throughout this, Rishi Sunak has said, I'm not going to promise jobs. But there's been fairly, lots of conversations. For example, I think there is a sense that the fact that Suella Braverman seems pretty nailed on for Home Secretary under Liz Truss is because in the second round, when she was knocked out, she told her Brexiteer backers to get behind Liz Truss. And an agreement was made. That is what lots of people think happened. Of course, it is not confirmed. And therefore, in terms of the cabinet roles, I think the vast majority of those are going to go to people who have come out for Liz Truss, whether that's early or later on in the campaign. I think there is more space in terms of those who backed Rishi Sunak in the junior ministerial ranks. But speaking to those quite close to Liz Truss, I think there is a line that they think has been crossed by some, which is how aggressive have you been in this campaign? Have you gone out on the attack on the morning round? Have you sent tweets suggesting that Liz Truss's plans don't add up? That could mean that you were, left on the side benches. I think if we're looking at what could actually unite the party, from speaking to lots of figures for this column, I think the one I just wondered perhaps could come through is perhaps everyone's just so tired. MPs want this leadership contest to be over. They've wanted it to be over, several weeks ago, and therefore there isn't much appetite to go through this all again in the next, in the next year. So that might mean there's a little bit less bloodletting, but I think that is probably a hope rather than certain.
I think the other thing, Kate, to take into account is that, as always happens in the lifetime of a parliament, is that the Tory backbenches are going to be packed with rather angry, disillusioned, dispossessed big beasts, all well-known names to the media, all newsmaker names. Rishi Sunak, almost certainly. I mean, if Braverman is going to be the new Home Secretary, is Priti Patel going to be on the backbenches after this? Perhaps Dominic Raab will be on the backbenches, and someone else will be on the backbenches, and that's somebody called Boris Johnson, who is the biggest newsmaker of them all. So there's plenty of scope for mischief, for criticism, for big news, because it's always, for us as journalists, it's always bigger news when you're being attacked by your own side. I mean, it's Labour's job to attack the Tories. It isn't necessarily blue on blue to do that. When I was looking back, if you look at when Margaret Thatcher stepped down, John Major lost the election, David Cameron stepped down, and then Theresa May stepped down. Not one of these outgoing prime ministers ever had a chance, or I believe ever wanted to come back as prime minister. But when I see what's coming out of the Johnson camp at the moment, there's all sorts of indications that he's, it's not just hasta la vista, as he said, it's I'll be back. There's this sense that he still thinks he'll be vindicated, it'll be a complete disaster this winter, and he may well be back, and he will not be able to stop himself. I mean, publicity to Boris Johnson is like oxygen to the rest of us. He needs it to keep alive. And he will quickly find out, if at the moment he just says something like, it could be rainy tomorrow, that will be front page news. And he'll say, hey, look at all the publicity I've just got. And he will not be able to stop himself from doing it. And that will make life very difficult for Liz Truss as Prime Minister.
And yet, Andrew, there's a risk here that the public become very tired of Tory infighting and Tory drama. With the cost of living crisis, they have their own problems to worry about, let alone the problems in the Tory party. Do you think the party is soon going to be punished for this sense of ongoing drama?
Well, the public don't like parties that are divided, and particularly governing parties, and they don't like parties that squabble among themselves. But I think that's true with knobs on when you're in the middle of an economic tsunami, as we will be by the autumn of this year. I mean, I don't believe the Citibank forecast that inflation will hit 18%, but we know that it's going to be high and it's going to be very painful, and that cost of living crisis is going to get worse. The recession is beckoning, certainly a major slowdown. That'll be true in Europe and probably in America as well, if it's not already happened in America by the technical definition. These will be grim economic times. There are a whole slew of how can I put it, transport disruption going on through strikes. Liz Truss is a leader who's no experience of dealing with labour issues at all. So if at a time of what you might call national crisis, and I see one cabinet minister, I think it was Kwasi Kwarteng, has talked of that we are in a national economic emergency, I think that is the one time above all when the British people will not expect his governing party to be knocking lumps out of each other. So, Katy, I think it's very dangerous for the Tories.
And Katy, on that point, I mean, from your perspective, how does the party hang on for at least 2 more years and going into a general election make the case when such difficult economic times, they're not just here, I mean, they have arrived, but many people think this is the beginning, that it's only going to get worse?
Well, I think it's an interesting question, which is when would Liz Truss decide to call for an election? And as ever, people saying, oh, could she go for an early election given the next few years are going to be so grim? Perhaps she'll get a honeymoon, perhaps she'll get a bounce. For example, Labour, I mean, private documents, but you get the sense they might want them out there as suggesting they think she'll get a big bounce. That to me seems quite tricky. It may not happen just given how difficult things are for most people at the moment. The fact that lots of people don't really think now is the time for a Tory leadership contest. But say she does get it, go up a bit in the polls, the Tories perhaps edge back over Labour in that scenario. I still don't think she'll really go for an early election because what effectively is the message to voters? We have a majority in the region of 80, I think 71 at the last count, but we want to go for probably a smaller majority in an election, and then we'll be able to deal with the cost of living in a more thorough way. It doesn't really work in terms of a message, and therefore actually will she try and push this back as far as possible? I think the best hope for the Conservatives is they just, weather this storm and things start to improve, inflation starts to look as though it's going down before the next election, but given how tricky it is to navigate and some of the potential risks of Liz Truss's economic plans in terms of the potential effect on inflation, that could be very hard to do.
Andrew, when we go into the next election, whether it's next year or the year after, we're looking at 13, 14 years of a Tory government, sometimes in coalition, sometimes not, but the Tories have been steering the ship. Is there any way to look at this now, apart from essentially managed decline, that there has to be a reset at some point? The other side has to get in at some point. And with things looking as bleak as they are about to be, we just have to interpret all of this as how you manage that decline, rather than, can you avoid the decline?
Well, I agree with Katy that I don't think a Truss administration will be in no position to call an early election, because this cost of living crisis isn't going away quickly. She's going to make a ton of mistakes as an incomer, as a novice. Her television performances are going to be a matter of national interest, let me put it politely, that way. So I think I would guess the earliest she would have an election would be in the spring or early summer of 2024, which is a little less than 2 years away. If, of course, she gets her act together, then there is still all to play for. If she really does know what she's doing, if she really does have a plan for growth, the current period that we're in could be very different. I mean, the cost of living crisis could be over. Inflation could have come, but by 2024, inflation will be back down, not to the Bank of England's 2% target, but I suspect it'll be under 5%, maybe even under 4%. Wages will be strong because the labour market will be tight, and maybe she will have thought of a number of things to do that are popular. So I wouldn't rule it out. But as we sit here at the moment, as we move into the autumn of 2022, you would have to say that the Tories have an uphill struggle to keep on to power. They don't seem to know what to do with that power anymore. They don't really have a vision or a mission or a set of really important policies, other than very vague ones about tax cuts. They have no idea how to get a hold of government spending. And Keir Starmer, bit by bit, undemonstrably, not with a massive cut through, but bit by bit, he's getting his party back on track and making it a party that very different from Michael Foot way back in 83, even Neil Kinnock in 87, or Jeremy Corbyn in 2017 and 2019. People aren't going to be frightened by Keir Starmer. They may not want a Labour government. They may not want Mr. Starmer as Prime Minister. But it ain't going to frighten the horses the way these previous Labour leaders did. And so I think if he just keeps his head down, keeps plodding, and there may even be a sense that people would want a period of quiet under an undemonstrative, rather dull Labour government compared to the endless fireworks under the Conservatives.
Andrew and Katy, thanks for joining me. Turning now to China, the Spectator's Cindy Yu, in her column this week, argues that you can either be a China hawk or you're a shill for China. She increasingly feels like there's no in between. She joins me now. Cindy, in your column for the magazine this week, you talk about the S word. What is that word?
So the S word is the word shill, and I talk in my column about how much I dislike it. Now, that's not because there are no shills in the UK planted by foreign states like China. There are, of course there are. I mean, only earlier this year, MI5 warned about Christine Lee giving Barry Gardiner hundreds of thousands of pounds. I'm not sure why Barry Gardiner, because clearly she wasn't that good of a... Anyway, whatever. So that clearly these real shills exist. But what I have a problem with is when people accuse certain people in the China world or whatever it is of being shills just because what they say, what their analysis is based on their experience or their knowledge about China, for example, doesn't fit with a certain worldview. And in the China policy world, we're seeing this increasing black and whiteness coming on, where you're either a China hawk, in which case you believe in cutting off diplomatic relations, you believe in declaring genocide, or if you're falling anywhere short of that, then you're shilling for China. And it's a word that I've heard many times. Occasionally it's applied to me, never to my face, or often in comment sections, or, I hear friends of people talking to my friends about that, but also to other organisations and other experts who, are much more established, have a lot to say, have a lot of value to offer at this critical moment of our relations with China, but are just being written off because what they're saying doesn't fit with the extreme hawkish worldview, and that's really what I'm railing against.
You talk a bit about your personal experience in your piece for the magazine, and you say that in the past you recognized it as objectively good banter with people that you knew and trusted to have jokes around this idea of being a shill, but that it's becoming less and less funny because you feel like it's an accusation that is actually levied at you from time to time and one that you find quite offensive.
Yeah, I mean, for the reasons that I've explained, I think fundamentally it is a funny joke, and when I know people don't mean it seriously, it's funny to go along with it. I mean, just look at me, listeners and viewers will hear my suspiciously posh accent, even though I wasn't even born in this country. I couldn't speak English until the age of 10. Where did this accent come from? People will point to the fact that I was born and bred in China. My first language is Mandarin, which I still speak and read, as well as the fact that I work in the heart of Westminster now. So what better place for the CCP to play some kind of spy, right? And that's a really funny joke to go along with. But when it's actually, as I say, pushing out people with expertise, and I don't necessarily count myself in that. I just mean, one example I give is the Great Britain China Centre. Now, Kate, this is an arm's length body of the Foreign Office set up in 1974, so not a golden era legacy from the David Cameron, George Osborne years, but its work basically included promoting and supporting liberal minds within China and helping them get legal reform and criminal justice reform, a very laudable goal, as well as in Westminster, training MPs and civil servants up on their China 101, basically answering questions like, who's in charge in China? Who's in charge in the Chinese Communist Party? What does Beijing want in Xinjiang? All these very vital questions that even China hawks need to have answers to. This centre gave those answers in a very extensive way. It got different experts in. But Liz Truss, in one of her final acts as Foreign Secretary, has actually axed the funding for the centre, so it now looks set to close. And it was only asking for about £500,000 a year, which is, surely peanuts in her mind these days, which only operates in billions of pounds these days. And the reason for that, I hear from those close to her, is because she sees it as a China shill organisation. And the reason she sees it as that is because it sometimes hosts CCP officials like the Chinese ambassador to the UK. Now, Kate, I realise I'm going on, but last I checked, we still have diplomatic relations with China. And if anything, it's very valuable for our MPs to be able to speak to and challenge their CCP counterparts, because otherwise access is incredibly hard, especially at this moment where it does look like we're going into a very tense moment with China. So to axe the funding of a centre like this, which hasn't been funded by the Chinese, it has been funded by the British and has always worked within the realms of British foreign policy, just seems to me so short-sighted. And I quote Professor Rana Mitter from Oxford University, probably UK's most eminent China expert, where he says, we've gone in this country from the golden era to now, we've gone from complacency to panic without the intervening stage of knowledge. And, fundamentally, I think that sums up the entire problem.
You make some good Cold War comparisons in your piece, noting that the expertise in the UK around Russia back then, it was arguably very good and something that we just don't have today in the UK when it comes to China. But I suppose the counter to your case for the Great Britain China Centre is that perhaps that isn't where you develop those skill sets and those people and that knowledge. Is a taxpayer-funded, quasi-public academic body really the place to achieve this? I mean, surely this is an issue that's better for the Foreign Office and for our intelligence service to really be beefing up their recruitment and improving the skill set and the knowledge within those bodies to make sure that we are able to have this dialogue when it's appropriate, but frankly, more aggressive discussions when it's appropriate.
Absolutely. I mean, I think I don't see it as an either or, which is the assumption of your question. I think if we can have all of those things, that would be fantastic. And here I sound like Liz Truss as well. But fundamentally, the situation in our Foreign Office...
Yes, Cindy, where are your spending cuts?
Well, on China, I am cakeist. I believe in having all of the expertise we possibly could have, and I believe in having more funding for it. When we look at the status quo in our establishment at the moment, it's incredibly dire. So this magazine's Steerpike columnist found recently that there were only 41 diplomats in the Foreign Office who speak Mandarin. That's less than the amount of people who speak Russian even now, and certainly much, much less than the amount of people who spoke Russian during the peak of the Cold War. There's just not enough expertise there. The Secret Services recently basically admitted this problem and have gone on a recruitment drive, the results of which I hope we'll be seeing in the coming years. But when you look at academia, when you're looking at schools, Mandarin is very rarely offered in our schools. We're still taught about the Tudors and the Nazis again and again and again, and you can go through your entire school career without learning about the rest of the world, let alone about China. And also when you're looking at universities, a shocking statistic is that actually there are only 300 graduates of Chinese language each year in the UK, and that's a number that hasn't increased since 1999, which was before China joined the WTO. So we are in a completely different world now, but the British education system and the British establishment hasn't woken up to that yet. And I guess what I'm saying is that, fine, let's be hawkish all you want, but let's have expertise behind that. Let's know where it's going to hurt the CCP if you really want to do that, because you can't just go around stabbing in the dark, which unfortunately I think is what we're doing at the moment.
Do you think the US and other countries are better prepared to have the difficult conversations around China than the UK? I mean, these conversations are certainly growing in the US, but do you think that the expertise and the resources in, say, the United States are going to better equip them than what we have here in the UK?
I think that is true. There are many more China experts in the US. For the US government, China is much more of a deliberate policy than the kind of ad hoc issue by issue thing we're seeing in the UK. And partly that's to do with history. I mean, if you bear in mind the fact that before China was communist, the Nationalist Party had very close links with the American government, and that's why America has such close links to Taiwan these days. And that's a rapprochement, that's a historical link, direct bilateral relations that has continued after a brief break, but that has continued with modern China as well. The UK hasn't ever had that kind of direct bilateral relationship. And, what little shared history China and the UK have often been tainted by brutality, if you think about the Opium Wars. So I think we are catching up here, and we can get more help from the US. And certainly in my podcast for The Spectator Chinese Whispers, I often have American guests on more than British guests, just because there's many more people there talking about China. But, we can catch up, and I think we must, because our approach to China has to be different to the US approach, because we are not the US. And so in order to do that, let's basically, to use the jargon of the Foreign Office, build our China capability, and to start doing that by not writing off experts as shills.
Cindy, thanks for joining me. A new book, Second City, looks at Birmingham's role in British history. It doesn't always get the fairest hearing, says its author Richard Vinen. Why? Richard joins me now alongside Adrian Wooldridge, global business columnist at Bloomberg. Adrian, Richard, thanks so much for joining Spectator TV. To start, Richard, your book Second City is all about how Birmingham became so central to Britain's history. Why is the city so often overlooked?
I think a variety of reasons. I think partly because it's a very unglamorous city, so it's kind of the city of crossroads. It's not, especially in recent years, a very physically attractive city. I suppose it's close to London, so I used to live in Houston in Texas, and it struck me, in Houston in Texas you can drive for 90 miles and not leave the city limits, and if you drive for 90 limits in Birmingham you'd be in Trafalgar Square. So it sort of feels like it doesn't have the kind of separate identity in some ways that a northern city might have. So I think those are some of the reasons. I think it also doesn't quite fit people's kind of expectations of what a provincial city or a working class city ought to be. So especially in the post-war period, it seems to me that, the provinces have a kind of cult, but it's a cult that revolves around them behaving like a provincial city ought to behave. And especially during this great kind of boom from the late 30s to the mid 70s, when Birmingham has very full employment, it's always a bit kind of brassy and over self-confident. And I think that kind of means it's not what people want, a working class, non-London place to be. So Priestley, J.B. Priestley, writes about Birmingham, writes this book, English Journey, in the early 30s. And he has a wonderful phrase about Birmingham. He says it has the wrong kind of vulgarity, very disapproving. And I think lots of people think that Birmingham has the wrong kind of vulgarity.
Adrian, you very recently wrote a column for Bloomberg saying that Birmingham was on the up. Do you think the city, however, is still underappreciated?
Oh, it's very much underappreciated, but there are people who are beginning to re-up Birmingham. I wrote the column just when we were about to have the Commonwealth Games, which puts a certain amount of focus on it. There's obviously the TV series Peaky Blinders, which has given us a sort of gangster glamour, the right sort of glamour in some ways to attract the attention of Hollywood and places like that. And I think it's also a very interesting city from a political point of view. I mean, Nick Timothy was a person who focused very much on Birmingham with the notion of Erdington Man and his cult of Joe Chamberlain. He said that this is the sort of city that we need for the future of conservatism, because conservatism needs to find a way of addressing people outside London, addressing the sort of the manufacturing sector of the economy with a rebalancing of the economy towards the manufacturing industry, and addressing sort of ordinary people, the great mass middle of Britain. And although the Nick Timothy project sort of imploded in many ways, I think it was the first signs of a reorientation of the Conservative Party towards ordinary Britain. And I think the fate of Birmingham and the fate of the Conservative Party and its attempt to address, they talk a lot about addressing the north, but a lot of it is about addressing middle provincial England, just outside the sort of the obvious northern belt with its peculiar identities. So I think Birmingham really matters at the moment politically and as with Peaky Blinders culturally.
And Adrian, tell us a bit more about Joseph Chamberlain. He's a big part of your column. Once the mayor of Birmingham, he transformed the city, you say in your piece.
Yeah, well, Joseph Chamberlain was, in many ways, the creator of a new sort of conservatism. He starts off as a liberal, but he moves eventually to the right. And it's a new sort of conservatism which is based on the manufacturing sector, based on industry, and based on the notion of civic capitalism, the idea that you need to have great provincial cities, great provincial manufacturers, a duty of the business class to root itself in its localities and to do its best by its workers. And I think that sort of thing, again, is so central to Nick Timothy's vision of the future of conservatism. It's sort of slightly declined recently, but I think it has a big future. If you look at what's happening to American conservatism, again, you're seeing the Republican Party trying to turn itself into a manufacturing, sort of a manufacturing party, a party of the working class. And talking about civic conservatism, particularly in with Marco Rubio and things like that. So I think that on the broader scale of things, despite recent setbacks of that project in Britain, it will it's still got a long way to go. So Joseph Chamberlain is a figure that we should continue to grapple with.
Richard, in terms of the high points and the low points in the city's history, where does it comparatively sit today? Is it a good time to be a Brummie?
Yeah, it is, although for complicated reasons. So Birmingham is not the boom city it was. So in some ways its great economic years are actually the period 1945 to the 1970s, I suppose. It has a really bad time in the early 1980s. I think now it's on the up again, although on the up in a kind of as a more modest city. I think Birmingham doesn't quite now fit into the kind of iconic city mould that it would have done in the time of Joseph Chamberlain, and it would have done perhaps in a slightly different way in, say, the 1950s. So I think Birmingham's a much more livable city than it's ever been before in some ways, so that the city's finally discovered that the car is not the solution to everything. Which has transformed Birmingham massively. So they brought back trams, which were abolished in the 1950s. I think racially it's a much happier place than it was. Very nasty racist kind of culture around in bits of Birmingham when I was growing up. I get the sense there's much less of that kind of thing now. So I think Birmingham's a nicer place to live, an easier place to live, although in some ways, of course, it's become a more ordinary city. So a more ordinary city globally, in the sense that, a city with about 1 million inhabitants, there are dozens and dozens of these around the world now. So Birmingham is not the kind of city that people are looking at around the world as they were in the time of Joseph Chamberlain. And of course, he attracted huge attention from Americans thinking about how you run a city, from French people thinking about how you run politics. Birmingham doesn't have that kind of central interest now, but it's a nice place to be, I think. Perhaps, in some ways a more attractive place to live in than it's ever been before.
Adrian, what else separates Birmingham from those other cities? Would you say our second city is different when it comes to culture and politics?
Well, I wonder if I could query the idea of the second city. I know this is the title of Richard's book, but I think Andy Burnham in Manchester would vigorously say that the second city is indeed Manchester. And one of the characteristics of Birmingham is it's always been vying for this position of the second city. With most notably with Manchester. That's not a settled position, and I think part of its key characteristics is a sort of uncertainty or sort of anxiety about its identity. Manchester has a very clear sense of its identity. Liverpool has a very clear sense of its identity. I think Birmingham has never quite had that, or at least not had that since the days of when Joseph Chamberlain was mayor. It's been anxious about its identity, anxious about where it fits in the hierarchy, and the sense that it's looked down upon by the city just down the road, by London and the southern establishment is a very strong thing there. That anxious, uncertain about its position in the world, and not willing to project a common identity. Now, I think that's beginning to change. Peaky Blinders has been an enormous benefit to it, but also having a mayor, albeit a mayor of the wider West Midlands, not just of the city, in the form of Andy Street, who's a very articulate and proud Brummie, is giving it much more of a sense of self-confidence, which I think has been lacking and is extremely important.
Well, that takes me on to my last question to both of you. Richard, Andy Street is now the mayor of the West Midlands. How do you think he's done?
Well, I mean, he seems a very articulate, personable person. I'm sure he means well. He's not Joseph Chamberlain, and the culture of Joseph Chamberlain just isn't there anymore. So Adrian talked about confidence. Now, of course, and he's quite right to say Birmingham does have this sense of insecurity, a slightly paradoxical sense of insecurity, because, of course, Birmingham actually becomes the second city in terms of population, really, after Joseph Chamberlain in 1911, when the city expands a bit, expands quite dramatically. And the period where Birmingham is kind of demographically and economically important, which is really the 20th century, especially the early part of the 20th century, or the first 75 years of the 20th century, is also, curious enough, the period where it's least kind of culturally self-confident. So I think there's a bit of a dichotomy between economics and culture. In terms of Andy Street, I think I don't actually mention Andy Street in my book, and I'm sort of getting ready to write lots of cross letters to reviewers explaining why I don't mention him, because they're all going to say, why don't you mention him? And the reason is, A, because he's mayor of the West Midlands, not Birmingham. He didn't actually win a majority of votes in Birmingham. B, because there's a very small turnout in the mayoral election, about half, less than half what you get in a parliamentary election. And of course, in parliamentary terms, Birmingham is very heavily represented by Labour MPs. I think the Tories are barking up the wrong tree with the idea that Birmingham is their great white hope for the future, because Birmingham is probably a more strongly Labour city now than it ever has been before. And Andy Street doesn't have vast powers. So when you look at Chamberlain, this extraordinary, dynamic, ruthless figure who transforms Birmingham, who builds things, who spends money, who buys things. Poor old Andy Street, it's very much kind of an exercise in branding, it seems to me. Andy Street's a great one for naming things. And I noticed when I looked at the most recent map of Birmingham that one of the great tendencies in Birmingham now is that when an area is problematic, you recall it something which will sound kind of attractive, like Heartlands or something like that. So it seems to me that, Andy Street's a man who is selling images and selling words. But if you look at the previous people who've dominated Birmingham, if you look at Chamberlain in the 19th century, if you look in a perhaps less clear-cut, attractive way at Herbert Manzoni, the city engineer, very powerful figure in the post-war period, these men both left a very strong physical legacy. You could point to buildings and say, this is their Birmingham. I don't think Andy Street's going to leave something like that. I was very amused when I was reading about Birmingham, trying to think of something to say about Andy Street's Birmingham, that one of the kind of characteristic initiatives is the creation of something called a central technology corridor, which sounds very dramatic, which is going to lead from Birmingham University out into Worcestershire and take in the old Longbridge factory and revive the economy and so on and so forth. And I asked my mother, do you know what the central technology corridor is? And she said, the faintest idea. No one she knows what it is, which is strange because they all live in it. So I do think Andy Street is probably not going to have a very transformative effect on Birmingham.
Adrian, do you think Andy Street has done well?
Yeah, let me say a few words in favour of Andy Street. He's obviously, a relatively small figure compared with Joseph Chamberlain, but so are we all. That's a giant to compare people with. But I think one of Birmingham's problems is it's a very sort of fissiparous city. It's not got no natural centre. People's sense of the place is local. It's their suburb rather than the city. It doesn't have a dramatic set of buildings at the centre in the way that somewhere like Chicago does. And I think Street has been quite good in providing a centre to the place. And he's also been quite good at building coalitions of people. It's a very fragmented ruling class there. He's been very good at bringing them together, getting them all on board and giving them a sense of sort of common purpose and identity. I think that's a very important political skill, although not a high-profile one. And he's also been very good in terms of the relations with the government, because with the mayors, I think the mayoral initiative is one of the great initiatives of the Conservatives in recent years, in the sense that Britain is a much, much too centralised country, and handing power back to the localities and to the provinces is a very important part of what conservatism should be about. And Andy Street has played a vital role in that, in the sense that he is a Conservative mayor. Most of the other high-profile mayors, particularly with Andy Burnham, are Labour figures, and he has been good at selling the idea of devolution, essentially, to the Conservative Party in London, proving that you can, as a Conservative, win a mayoral region like that. And I think he's been very influential. He's the person not only that the government goes to when it wants to talk about the future of devolution, but also the person that people like Andy Burnham on the Labour side will talk to when it says, how can we get this message across to the government? So I think both in terms of building a sense of identity and a set of alliances in Birmingham, and selling this incredibly important policy of devolution to the Conservative Party, the current Conservative Party, he's been a pretty important national figure. So not Joe Chamberlain, but certainly not nothing.
Adrian and Richard, thanks for joining me. And finally, when people hear about cow attacks, they're often waiting for some sort of punchline at the end. But John Connolly says it isn't so funny. To talk about his recent scrape, he joins me now. John, in this week's magazine, you warn that cow attacks are no laughing matter. Tell us about your recent experience.
Oh, thank you, Kate. They are a tiny bit of a laughing matter, I should say, but I'm writing a bit about my piece about how we should take them maybe a little bit more seriously. So my incident happened, it was a couple of years ago. My partner and I, Claire, were walking in Devon. We'd been out all day and we arrived at this sort of quite large field, and the only public footpath in the field was running straight through into a herd of cows on the other side who were kind of congregating around the stile that we needed to get through. So we set off, kind of trying to be as confident as we could. We've always been a bit sort of spooked by animals, but, being cautious but confident. And then most of the cows were very happy, just kind of ignoring us. We didn't hear anything from them. And then this one sort of slightly larger cow, kind of the moment we came in the field, sort of looked at us and was staring at us quite intently. But we decided at this stage probably not a point where we should panic, so we carried on. It then started sort of trotting towards us, and we thought, well, we'll veer off to the left a bit and sort of try and curve around them so it realises we're not coming for it, we're not being aggressive, and it's probably just a bit curious and will leave us be. And then slowly the cow started to pick up pace, and until it was sort of full on galloping towards us, which at that point we kind of just froze in our tracks and were like, okay, try not to spook it, it's going to stop when it reaches you. And we kind of kept still and still as it got closer and closer until it was barely sort of a metre away or something like that. And it felt like right on top of us, and it kind of didn't look like it was stopping at that point. So I kind of completely panicked and shouted "run" at the top of my voice. At that point, the cow stopped, reared up on its back legs, and kind of went for me, basically. And we both sprinted off in slightly different directions.
Oh, my gosh.
But it went for me. It was awful. And afterwards, my partner could see it, and she was saying it was gaining on me, basically. It was right on my back. And she thought I was going to be trampled to death. So, we managed to it was sort of an L-shaped field, and we managed to go around the corner, and it kind of eased off then, and managed to escape through a hedge. And afterwards, we kind of it was a completely ridiculous sort of situation. But quite soon afterwards, we were like, well, we're actually quite traumatized by this. We were quite shaken up, and we took at least a couple of days to sort of calm down and be like, okay, it's all fine, it's all going to be okay. So
it's so scary, John. There's nothing funny about that. You've kind of already answered my second question, which was how close you thought you were to being trampled by a killer cow, and it sounds like you were pretty darn close.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of looked up afterwards. I was like, was it just us, were we being a bunch of wusses? And then you kind of come across these reports of quite serious incidents where people are sort of battered by cows. They come away with serious injuries. The reason I did the piece, actually, was reminded of it, was that last week a woman in Lancashire was out walking. I think she was with a group of people, and the cows surrounded her, didn't let her go, and then were headbutting her, and she had, I think, 15 broken ribs. She tried to walk, and her foot just gave way. I think she'd got a shattered ankle. So she had to crawl out of this field on her hands and knees and sort of pull herself over a wall before mountain rescue could arrive. So it kind of underlined to me that, these things can be quite serious, and that's the problem.
Yeah, terrifying. Can you give us a bit of perspective, having written up this piece and looked at some of the statistics around it? How worried should people be about cow attacks? What do the figures say? Is this a frequent occurrence?
I mean, I wouldn't be worried if you're in your own home. There's a cow.
Okay, right, sure. Context matters.
It's basically more common than you think. So, I mean, not that many people are killed by cows every year. I think it's sort of around 4 or 5. Quite a few of those will be people who work on farms. But, there are usually 1 or 2 walkers. Last year, it was particularly high because I think a lot of people were out in the countryside during lockdown. But the point so I talked a bit to a campaign group which was set up a few years ago called Killer Cows, and they collect sort of people's stories and that kind of thing, and they kind of point out that whilst the worst, most tragic incidents do get recorded in terms of deaths and occasionally the most serious injuries in the papers, we kind of don't really have a huge idea of how many near misses, how many sort of minor injuries and quite nasty scares happen, and I suspect it's a lot more frequent, basically.
Well, since your scrape with the killer cow, have you done any research as to how walkers can stay safe, especially if they're quite close to these herds?
Yeah, I mean, this is a really interesting thing. So one thing that does seem to be the case is that people with dogs are the ones who tend to be more seriously hurt, but equally there's a decent theory that around half of the sort of attacks happen without dogs anyway. An obvious one is to avoid cows with calves, but equally I think it can just sort of happen out of the blue. I think a common misconception as well apparently is that cows see red and go after you for that. That's not the case. Apparently they don't really see red very well. Though I have been told, which apparently works, is that you shouldn't carry sort of carrier bags when you're going through a field with cows, because they can often mistake you for someone carrying food and are more likely to come over. But there is a bit of blind luck to it, to be honest, and I think you can just be a bit unlucky.
Well, I'm really glad you were on the lucky side. You say in your article that most people will listen to a story about a cow attack and wait for the punchline, but most people who have been in this experience don't have a punchline to give because they don't actually find it all that funny.
Yeah, and it's kind of mixed. As I was saying, you do sort of acknowledge that you're in a ridiculous situation when you've been attacked by a cow, but then, but it is a sort of strange thing, is that if you are a bit traumatized by it, if you are a bit upset, I mean, maybe trauma is too long a word, but I think too strong a word, but there's something close to it at least. You kind of are looking for a bit more sympathy, and you think if any animal of that size had chased someone, I mean, cows weigh a similar amount to black bears, for example. I'd rather be chased by a cow than a bear, I should add. But the point being is that...
but we don't want either situation, right? This doesn't have to be the trade-off.
No, but yeah, you don't tend to get tons of sympathy, to be honest. I think people do think it is a bit funny. And the woman I was talking to at the Killer Cows was saying that people who've had really horrendous injuries, like actual hospitalizations and things, are still met with a lot of these jokes about, you know, oh, you should move out the way, why didn't you understand, all that kind of stuff. Yeah, so I think it is sort of, we can sort of see a bit of the humour in it, but I think, yeah, it should be taken a tad more seriously and have a bit of empathy for those who've had a desperate run-in with a cow. I think is the
well, I certainly will, now having listened to your experience. My last question, John, is since your recent encounter with the cow, will you be thinking twice before you go on another rambling through the countryside?
We have since, to be honest. It's spooked us a bit. We do try and go on walks still, but I tend to try and pick out ones which are a bit more sort of mountainous and hilly because I think there'll be fewer cows. The higher you go up.
Cow-free.
If we come across cows in a field, we do always try and find like another field we can sort of pass through. That might annoy some if there are any farmers listening because you're meant to stick to the right of way. But it's kind of it's motivated by fear rather than malice. But it's not always possible to avoid cows in the countryside, and I don't think it ever will be. So yeah, it's a difficult one to get around, and it's obviously a balance because I know farmers have very difficult times and they probably hear all this and they think, well, we do enough, we've got enough pressures on without having to worry about walkers, you know, potentially being hurt by a cow. But as all these things, it's a bit of a balance, and yeah, that's how it's affected us anyway.
It's all about those calculated risks. John, thanks for joining Spectator TV.
Thank you very much, Kay.
And that's it for this week. Remember, if you enjoy what we do here at The Spectator, you can subscribe to the magazine and to our online content. Join today and you'll pay just £1 a week for unlimited online and app access in your first year. To subscribe today, go to spectator.co.uk/TV offer. And don't forget to subscribe to The Spectator's YouTube channel. Just click the subscribe button at the bottom of this video and tap the bell icon to make sure you never miss an episode. Thanks again for watching, and do join us again next week on The Week in 60 Minutes.